Hello, this is Chuck Ridgway, Automation Technology Manager at Horner. Thanks for joining us for another Tuesday live stream. Now, last week, in part one of our topic, Retrofitting Legacy OCS, we talked about how you can retrofit systems from way back in 1998, the very first generation text-based OCS, to newer controllers and all the steps that are required to do that. Now this week, we're going to fast forward just a few years to the early 2000s and start talking about the first graphical OCS units. In other words, the first OCS units that featured a pixel-based display. Now joining me again this week is my colleague Casey Gardner. Hey Casey.
Hey, how's it going, Chuck?
It's going great. Now last week I would say the big idea was the fact that even if you're retrofitting a system from 1998 that's 20 plus years old, that's got a text-based display, you can still retrofit and still utilize the ladder logic. What would you say is the big idea or the takeaway for this week?
Yeah, for this week, it's really a little bit or of a next generation of those products was our first graphical OCSs, like you mentioned, and those products we can actually utilize a lot of their graphics as well. So I think that's what you plan on covering for sure.
Absolutely. So again, with text-based OCS, while you can reutilize or reuse the ladder logic, reusing the graphics was not an option because there wasn't any graphics, it was just text. So Casey's going to be manning the chat this week, like he always does. If you have any questions and you're watching live, go ahead and give those to us in the chat section. If you are watching this on replay, we still want your questions. Go ahead and give them to us in the comment section. Okay, thanks Casey. Let's go ahead and get started. Here's our breakdown of our topic for today, Retrofitting Legacy OCS Part 2, where we're talking about those early OCS graphical units. Now keep in mind, we are building upon last week. So even for those of you who have a graphical unit that need to be retrofit, you need to take a look at part one because it covers a lot of the important steps in terms of examining the I/O requirements, taking a look at the ladder logic and reusing that. So you will need to check out part one even if you do have a graphical unit and not a text-based unit. But building upon last week, we're going to talk about a brief history of the graphical units, when they started, what they were all about. We're going to give you a little bit of a tour of the hardware. I've got some older units here I'm going to show you. We're going to talk about the recommended replacement units, some of the modern hardware you can use in lieu of these original systems. We're going to summarize the retrofit procedure. Again, it's a very similar, if not identical, procedure as last week. It's just got a couple variations because of the fact we're dealing with graphics from a user interface standpoint. And then I'm going to give you a couple of techniques for modifying those graphics if you want to reuse them. All right, here we go. Let's start with that history of Graphics OCS. So after the really big success of text-based OCS as it was introduced in the late 90s, at some point, a couple years later, it was time to expand into graphical-based units. Now remember when I told you last week that one of the reasons we didn't start with graphical user interface on OCS was because of the limitations on the microprocessor. So when we did go to graphics in the early 2000s, we went with a dual microprocessor approach, where we had one processor dedicated to logic and a second one dedicated to the graphics, and then those two processors shared RAM for variables. Okay, so these truly were the first high-performance all-in-one controllers that had a graphical user interface. Some of the models that were available before us just didn't have very good performance, and at Horner we've always felt that performance, especially when it came to logic solving, was especially important. Now, when the graphics became popular, right about that same time, we released some other products that kind of expanded the I/O capacities of OCS. And that's important to be aware of as well, because with some of those graphical systems, they tended to have a little bit more I/O than some of the original text-based units did. Now, one of the things we released, one of the products we released that kind of expanded the I/O capability was something called an RCS. So this was really an OCS without a screen. Now, even though it was a full controller, and a lot of customers used it like a PLC, other customers used it like a remote I/O block. So if you remember correctly, the original OCS utilized Smart Stack I/O that stacked on the back of the OCS, and you were limited to 4 modules total. Now with RCS, distributing I/O over CAN, now suddenly you could expand beyond that limitation of 4 modules. And then the next thing we did was we introduced something called fiber optic bases, or FOX bases. These definitely expanded the I/O in that they allowed Smart Stack I/O to be stacked on these remote bases that were connected using fiber optics up to 10 meters away from the OCS. So now you went from having 4 local modules only to the potential of having a total of 20 modules between what's stacked on the back and the remote I/O bases. So again, sometimes with some of the graphical OCS systems, the I/O count can be a little bit larger. So we have to consider that when we're doing retrofits. Now, as the 2000s went along, there were a lot of new products that came out. OCS was really taking hold. It was becoming very popular. The volume went way up. So we expanded from all metal type products to include plastic designs. So our next generation OCS were our first plastic designs. And not only were the main OCSs themselves made of plastic, but we also adapted the Smart Stack I/O with a plastic chassis as well. Right in this time frame, we also released Smart Sticks, which was our first pure remote I/O solution. And Smart Sticks is still a viable product today, of course. And then in addition to going to new plastic designs, we also expanded into color graphics, especially that really culminated with the QX series, which offered a variety of units from 6 inches up to 15 inches as well. And then another product that I should mention is the RX371. That's a product where we actually went back to metal for some more rugged applications that some of our customers requested. Now, other than the Smart Sticks, all the products you see on the screen here are all obsolete at this stage. So it's very possible that these products are among those systems that you need to replace at some point. And so these are all systems that would apply to today's webinar, today's live stream. Okay, let's do a quick hardware tour of some of this older hardware, just so you can get an idea of what it looks like before we continue on. And we're starting here with the very first graphical OCS. This was the OCS 250. Okay, it was still made of metal, introduced, I believe, right around 2000 or so. And effectively, it still supported Smart Stack. You could have up to 4 Smart Stack modules on the back here. This one doesn't have any. And it was also the first product that we sold that had more than 1 serial port. So it had 2 serial ports, in addition, of course, to the CAN port that's been around since the beginning of OCS. Now, from a display standpoint, it was a monochrome display, 240 by 128 pixel. And again, it was a very popular product, the Graphic OCS. Now, here's that RCS I was talking about. That is effectively an OCS without a screen. So it is for all intents and purposes, it's a PLC really, except that it also was used by a lot of customers as a remote I/O block. So again, made of metal with up to 4 modules stacked on the side this time. And then for a true remote I/O solution, at least from a Smart Stack standpoint, we offered this remote fiber base. Here's one here. It interconnects with Toslink plastic fiber. You can have up to 4 modules plugged on it, and you could have up to 5 of these bases on a system. So you could end up with some fairly large I/O counts, and the maximum distance that any base could be away from the OCS was, I believe, 10 meters maximum. Okay, now the next thing we did was we started, as OCS became popular, we started with plastic designs, a little bit more elegant mechanically. The first designs, our first next generation designs, were the NX series. Again, made out of plastic, the first OCS plastic parts. These were graphical in nature. This was a small NX 222 that had the same pixels display as the current XLE does. We also had a 240 by 128 version as well. Still utilized Smart Stack, but the plastic version of Smart Stack, same electronics, but a new chassis. And then removable media here, as you can see, is compact flash, which obviously is a lot larger than what we're using today, of course. So this was the NX. And then as we went beyond that, let me make some room here, we had the QX series. So the NX and the QX were out at the same time, but it was for those customers that were looking for large colors touchscreens. This was the QX series. So we partnered with a Japanese company that helped us manufacture the front of the units, even though all the firmware was Horner firmware. And then we had a Horner designed backpack that went in the back to add the SmartStat capability along with CAN and fiber. And that was the QX units. And those were available anywhere from 6 inches all the way up through 15 inches. And those were obsoleted, I believe, maybe 5 or 7 years ago. So, at Horner, we do our best to provide these products as long as we can because our OEMs depend on them and they don't like to do redesigns too frequently. So all of these products, even though they may have been designed a long time ago, for a lot of them, they may have only been obsolete for a few years. Okay, now let's talk about some of the replacements that you can use with today's products for some of these older systems. So really, there is no one right answer when you try and decide, which controller of today's modern series do I replace a legacy unit with. Basically, again, there's not a lot of wrong answers here, but what are the factors that you would consider? Well, of course, what size is the screen you're replacing? Were the function keys used in the application? If they were and you want to maintain that, then you'll probably need to look at a unit that maintains function keys. What is the I/O requirement? Whether a unit is graphical based or a text-based OCS, the I/O requirement, of course, is a important factor that you need to take a look at. The Micro series and the XL series have very different I/O capabilities, at least in terms of what's built in. But again, if you're not really sure, for smaller screen applications, again, the 6-inch units, the EXL6 and the EXLW, those are good options for a variety of reasons. And then for larger units, you're probably looking at maybe a 10 or a 15. Now, another factor you might want to consider is the cutout. For a really long time, back to the early 2000s, we've been selling 5.7-inch OCS models. And that's because, especially back in those days, 5.7 was the most popular size for user interfaces, whether they had built-in PLCs like an OCS or whether they were just separate user interfaces. So we've offered them for many years. And then the newer products, the EXL6 and the EXLW, they both have the exact same cutout that you'll find on any 5.7-inch Horner unit we've ever sold. So they often will be a really good choice, especially if you're replacing a 5.7-inch unit. Now, if you're talking about I/O above and beyond that's on the back, then now you're talking about expansion I/O with one of our I/O families. But let's take a look at I/O in general. So first of all, usually for the I/O, the SmartStack I/O that was stacked directly on the back of these products, usually you can find a built-in I/O option for one of today's OCS models that will take care of those requirements pretty well. It's just when you're talking about the extra I/O that maybe was distributed on Fox or on RCS, where you need to take a look at additional I/O through things like Smart Rail, Smart Block, etc. One thing I will mention is if you've got an application that had a lot of high-speed counting, because high-speed counting was definitely a strength of the original OCS. If you've got an application with a lot of high-speed counters above and beyond the 4 that are built into most OCS models, then you may need to add some external high-speed counting capability beyond what's built in. So your best bets there are with the RCC6512, which we consider a high-speed counter coprocessor type module, if you will, or even an XLE used as a remote I/O block. That would be another option for adding additional high-speed counting to a system that originally just had a lot of high-speed counters, for instance. Okay, now we're going to get into the retrofit procedure for retrofitting these graphical units to a newer, more modern product. Now you'll notice if you were with us last week that these 6 steps have not changed from what we covered last week. It's still the same 6 steps whether you're replacing a text-based OCS or a unit with a pixel-based display. But we are going to highlight some of the differences, and there are some subtle differences when it comes to acquiring the program. So we're going to start there. So the first question you need to ask yourself is there a Cscape file readily available, a CSP file? Now, hopefully, the people who designed the original system archived that file away and it's readily available, even if it was created with an older version of Cscape and you've got access to it. We also talked last week about what happens if it's password protected. So check out last week's session for more details on that. Now, if you don't have access to the file already existing, then you may need to upload it. Now, in that scenario, if you're going to be uploading a program from a graphical unit, you're probably going to want to start with Cscape 8.8. That's probably a good starting point to attempt to upload the program from one of these older units that we've shown on the previous few slides. Okay? Now, if it was developed using a newer version of Cscape than that, Cscape will let you know that, and you'll need to try a newer version. Now, from a connectivity standpoint, if you're talking about one of these units that has a 9-pin serial port, then the advice we gave you last week about your programming connections are still valid. If you're talking about a unit that has an RJ45 serial port or multiple RJ45 serial ports, then our standard Horner cable kit, which is available today, will work great for those units when it comes to uploading. Now, once you've uploaded using an older version of Cscape, of course, you're going to want to immediately save the program, and you're going to want to be using that original version of Cscape to analyze things like the I/O usage, taking a look at the ladder logic, those sorts of things. And that is also, there's another important point we made last week, I'll make it again today, and that is you don't need to replace all the I/O on the previous system. You only need to replace the I/O that's actually being used. So there's a feature in Cscape called element usage, which will tell you for the I's, Q's, AI's, and AQ's that effectively is the real world I/O for the system. It'll tell you what's actually being used, because that's an important point. So for more details on that, again, check out last week's session. So again, acquiring the program is subtly different in terms of the version of Cscape that we recommend that you start with, for instance. Next, let's talk about where the most of the changes or the differences lie when it comes to the retrofit procedure, and that, of course, is on the user interface side of things, because the original text-based units had text-based user interface screens that could not be reused, whereas the pixel-based units have graphics which you may choose to reuse. So let's talk about that in some detail. The first thing you really need to ask yourself, though, of course, is, should I even reuse these graphic screens or not from this older project? And there are some scenarios where you may decide just to start over again, for instance, and not to use it. And that typically would be in those situations where you're, let's say, taking a small monochrome user interface unit and replacing it with a large color touchscreen version or a larger color touchscreen version. In those scenarios, when you're going from monochrome to color, you may be better off just more or less starting over again from a user interface standpoint. That's typically what I do. However, there's a lot of scenarios, a lot of older units that were color to begin with, and you're going to replace them with another color unit, maybe one that's slightly larger in size or slightly smaller in size. And in those scenarios, very often, upgrading from color to color, you can save a lot of time by reusing the screens. And of course, with anything graphics related, and this is true for a brand new from scratch system versus a retrofit, you can spend as much time as you want on the graphics. Sometimes poring over every pixel is really worth the effort. For some projects, maybe it's not. So again, with graphics, it always comes down to how much time do you want to spend on it. Now we're going to talk about two, what I think will hopefully be very practical demonstrations for you. And we're going to talk about two different scenarios for reusing your graphics from an old retrofit system to a new, more modern controller. Okay, the first scenario we've got is when we are changing to a higher resolution screen. So we're going from an older controller that had a lower resolution screen, and the newer controller we're replacing it with has a higher resolution screen. The specific example I'm going to give here is our ruggedized RX371 that had a 5.7-inch quarter VGA display, 320 by 240. We're going to give you an example of reusing the graphics for a project that was designed with that product, and we're going to replace it with an EXL6, which is also a 5.7-inch product, but this time it's got a 640 by 480 screen. So it's got 4 times the resolution. So that's the first example we're going to go through. Now the procedure we're going to go through as we update our graphics is kind of outlined on the screen there. And let me summarize it for you. So effectively, we're going to open up a copy of that Cscape program that we acquired but we're going to do it in a modern version of Seascape, for instance, Seascape 9.9. And since our resolution is going from low resolution to high resolution, the next step is we're immediately going to go to the hardware configuration and we're going to change from our RX371 model to our new model, which in my case here is an EXL6. Next, we're going to go in screen by screen and we're going to take a look at the graphics. And I'm going to show you how to take advantage of a feature called Fill All Screens. That allows you to take all the screens in a single step that were of a lower resolution and have Seascape automatically stretch them to a higher resolution. Now, it's not perfect and it's not a one-step process and you're done, but it's one step and then you're ready to make some adjustments. Okay, so it can be definitely a useful feature for sure. So that's what we're going to show next, and we're going to start with a live Seascape demonstration. So I'm going to start here with my RX371 program. Now this would have been a program that I would have acquired either through archive or maybe by uploading from an RX371, but I've opened it in Seascape 9.9. So I'm in the modern version of Seascape right now. And because we're going from lower resolution to higher resolution, we're going to go ahead and start by performing the hardware change first. Okay, so we go to the hardware configuration. I have to select, I'm in the QX series now, that's where the RX371 fit. I have to change over to the XL series, and I'm going to change to an EXL6, and then I need to pick the I/O model that best fits my application, and let's say the Model 4 is the one I want, so I'll go ahead and leave that alone there. Okay, so now I have changed to the new OCS controller. Now I need to go in and adjust my graphics. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the graphics editor. Okay, and you'll notice right away that all the screen information from the legacy project all fits in this upper left-hand corner here. Why is that? Well, that's because the RX371 had a resolution that was 1/4 of the resolution of the EXL6. So all of its graphics will fit in that upper left-hand corner. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take advantage of that Fill All Screens feature, and I'm going to go under the Screens menu and type Fill All Screens, and then Seascape is automatically going to go through and stretch all the screens. Okay, so it's done that. Now you can tell at a glance, and I've only got a couple screens here that I'm showing you, you can tell at a glance that it did what it was supposed to do, but there's some adjustments we're going to want to make. So as an example, we're going to want to go through and primarily we're going to be adjusting things like font sizes. So let's go with a much larger title here. Let's go ahead and bump up the font size for this particular data field. We probably don't need a data field with that much white space in it. Let's go ahead and make that a little bit smaller. Our text table here is pretty small. Let's go ahead and make that font bigger. So you can tell that mostly what we're doing here is we are adjusting font sizes. Now, even though that's a lot bigger than it was, we need to stretch this widthwise so we can fit all 13 characters in for this data field. I'll go ahead and adjust that here. I'll make this a little bit bigger. So you can get the idea that pretty much what we're doing is, for the most part, is we're adjusting font sizes. Okay? All right. And then I'll go ahead and make this size larger as well. I think I have room to go all the way up to 30. And there you go. So obviously it wasn't without some effort that I could reuse my existing screens, but keep in mind I didn't have to go in and modify any of these data fields. Those are all tied. Those will still work just like they did before. So it's really, for the most part, what we're talking about is work that's all about, you know, what things look like. And on this screen it's going to be the same. I'm not going to go through the trouble of showing every single step, but I'll go ahead and kind of move things up a little bit, center that. That might be what I want to do there. You know, again, adjust the size of some of the fonts. So that gives you an idea of what we're talking about. So depending on the complexity of the screen, we may spend a minute or two, or maybe even a little more than that, on each screen just to get the text the way we want it, maybe tweak some of the spacing, whatever the case is, as a result of making further adjustments after the Fill All Screens feature. Okay, now since we went ahead and changed over to the new controller as the first step before we even went in to work on our graphics, we're pretty much on a roll now. So we're continuing on with this program all the way to the end of our project. Okay, let's head back and talk about the next scenario, which is going to be where we actually are going down in resolution from a higher resolution older unit to a lower resolution newer unit. Now, why would we ever want to do that? That doesn't make any sense, right? At least on first glance. Well, there's a couple reasons it might. If we kind of go back to the 2000s, there were actually a lot more screen sizes that were common back in those days. I mean, you had 6, you had 8, you had 10, you had 12, you had 15. Whereas today, from a popularity standpoint, the most popular sizes for the most part are 7, 10, and 15. There's some bigger sizes as well. But those things have kind of narrowed down a bit, mainly because the industrial market is using the same glass that's popular in the consumer market. So there's less of sizes that are really available to the industrial market, at least the ones that have wide acceptance. So the 8.4-inch QX was a very popular product back in the day, and it had an 800 by 600 resolution, really high resolution. And from a size standpoint, the best replacement for that is probably an XL7. But keep in mind the XL7 has an 800 by 480 resolution, so it doesn't quite have the vertical resolution that the QX had, okay? So we're actually going to need to go from higher resolution to lower resolution in this case. Again, from a older 800 by 600 product to a newer 800 by 480 product. So our steps are a little bit different, similar but different. We start out the same with a copy of our Seascape program that we acquired through upload or from an archive, and then we open that in a newer version of Seascape, so that's the same. But the next step is different. Next, we have to go through and edit all the graphics, shrink them down to fit within the available space for the new display. We need to do that before we change our hardware configuration over to the new unit. That's an important step. Otherwise, the extra graphics will basically be cut off if we were to do the configuration first. And then once we're done with all the graphic manipulation, then we're going to go into the hardware configuration and change our model over to the newer unit, which in this example is an XL7. All right, so let's head back into Seascape. So now I'm going to open up my other project, which was based on a QX451. And because we're going from higher resolution to lower resolution, we have to manipulate our graphics first and shrink those down to fit within the space allowable in the new XL7. So here's what my screens look like. I've just got a couple example screens here. So this is a screen with 800 by 600 resolution, and we're going to have to fit everything down into 800 by 480 in kind of the most convenient way possible. So let me show you what I like to do here. So the method I use, the first thing I typically do is I want to group all of the legacy graphics into a single group. So I'm going to hit Control A to select everything, and then I'm going to right click and I'm going to say Group to group everything together. Okay, so now everything is more or less one object to manipulate. At least it is while it's grouped. Okay, the next thing I want to do is make it easy for me to understand where the limitations are with my new display. So I typically like to draw a box. So I'm going to pull up a rectangle here, plop it on the screen, double click on it, hopefully. Got to select the right spot, there we go. I'm going to make it a little easier to see by changing the color and thickening it up a little bit. And then I'm going to stretch it out until it is exactly 800 by 480. Okay, and I'm going to look in the lower right hand corner in Seascape and it'll tell me when I get to 480 pixels. There we are. And I now have a red box that's showing me where the 800 by 480 borders are. So now I'm going to go ahead and click on my legacy graphics that are all grouped together. And then I'm going to grab the corner and just stretch it the way I want to stretch it to fit within the new confines. And there's no one right answer. I just want it to look pretty decent. All right, I've done that. And now, you know what? There's not a whole lot else that I really have to change for this to look okay. I could mess around with the text a little bit, but basically I'm in pretty good shape here. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do one more screen for you. I'm going to go ahead and copy this red box so I don't have to create it from scratch. Next, I'm going to go to the next screen. This one's got a little bit more going on here. Now, anytime you have legacy screens that have bitmaps on them, and if you're going to be stretching and changing size, you may want to consider making sure that all the bitmap graphics is configured to scale, so that if you change its size, it will scale. Because remember, one of the options we have with bitmaps is to show it in its native resolution and not to scale it. So I'm going to double click on this graphic object here, which is showing up as a text object. So it must be buried somewhere there. Let me go ahead. What I'm doing now is I'm hitting the tab button until the graphical object is displayed. So apologize for the flashing here. So at some point we're going to get to the object. There we go. I believe that's the one. All right, let's send that to the back. Now let's click on this guy. There we go. Now I've got my bitmap object, and I'm going to select Scale to Fit. Now I'm going to send it to the back again so that the other objects in the front will be where they need to be. So now all the layers are set up the way they need to be. Now I'm going to go ahead and select all, because I believe that's this is a bitmap object here as well. I'm just going to go ahead and double click here, make sure that says Scale to Fit as well. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and select all. So let's go Control A, and then I want to group it. So let's group it. Okay, and then instead of recreating from scratch this red box, I'm just going to go ahead and copy it and paste it with a Control V. All right, now what I want to do is I want to grab this corner here and I'm going to scale everything. All right, there we go. That doesn't look too bad. There's a couple things I should probably fix. I think this pump would probably look better if it was in its original aspect ratio. So I'm going to get rid of the Scale to Fit there. And then this text is obviously too large. Let's change that down to 10 point. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and change this data field down one notch. And there we go. So I think that's pretty good, at least. So we're reusing those graphics. I didn't improve it much, but I did at least get it so that it translates pretty well from the old screen to the new screen. Okay, now that I've manipulated my graphics, and when I'm all done manipulating all my screens, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of this red box here because it's just there as a guide. So I'll delete that, go back to my other screen, delete that box. Okay, so I'm done manipulating all my graphics. Now I'm going to close the graphics editor, go back into hardware configuration, and now I'm going to change over to my XL7. So I switch to the XL series, switch to the XL7, select the model that I want to use. If it's different from that, I'll say that's okay, hit OK. And if I go back in and take a look at my screens that I just manipulated, you'll see they fit very nicely on the new 800 by 480 screen that is the XL7. So hopefully that gave you a flavor for the two different scenarios if you're reusing your graphics. There's technically three scenarios. One scenario is the resolution of the original unit is identical to the resolution of the new unit. That's a perfect scenario because you don't have to do any stretching at all or any scaling. Of course, if you're going from low resolution to high resolution, you can use the Fill All Screens function and then clean up after that. If you're going the other direction, like I just did, you're going to have to manually manipulate your graphics smaller to fit within the new confines of the new unit, and then change your hardware configuration. So that's basically a run through of those scenarios, and that pretty much wraps up what I wanted to cover today. So let's go ahead and bring in Mr. Casey Gardner. Hey, Casey. So does that jive with some of the methods you've used to manipulate graphics on some of the projects that you've done?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as long as you've got a handle on most of our graphics tools, it's really not too bad with just some small adjustments here and there, and makes it a lot easier and quicker to kind of get back up and running, which a lot of those scenarios typically
You're right,
are.
because if you've got a retrofit that happens because of necessity, as opposed to being fully planned way in advance, getting back up and running as fast as possible is a big deal, of course. Okay, very good. Thanks for standing by and answering those questions in the chat. If you are watching this on replay, don't hesitate to give us your questions in the comment section. Now, one other thing before I let Casey go, and that is this. If you're watching this on replay, when we recorded this, we were pretty close to the release of a couple new product series. We have an XL Prime series coming that we're going to launch next month. And then we also have an OCS I/O series that's coming in a few weeks. Okay, could be a little after that. So if you're watching this webinar, let's say, or this live stream, let's say in May or June or July of 2022 or later, those are other products that are available to you as new replacements when you've got a retrofit project. So don't forget about those as well. All right, thanks, Casey. All right, before we take off, I want to remind you of a couple things. First of all, don't hesitate to subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, next week, let me go back to the slides. Next week is like every other Tuesday where we're here live at 2 o'clock. All right, you can watch it live at 2 o'clock and get your questions answered right away. Or, of course, you can watch it on replay, but we're here every Tuesday on YouTube. Also, don't forget to check our website for new product announcements, also for other good information, and sign up for our newsletter so you'll be notified of what all the topics are for the upcoming month. So keep an eye out for our April newsletter. Hopefully you've already received that. And then finally, next week, we're going to be covering using the XLE as Ethernet remote I/O. Now, why are we doing this? Well, we've heard from a lot of you that you're really struggling in getting Ethernet IP I/O devices and even other Ethernet-based I/O, mainly from our competitors. So if you've got an application and you're needing to add Ethernet IP-based I/O or even Modbus TCP-based I/O, for instance, you should consider using the XLE as a remote I/O block mounted on DIN rail, probably inside of an enclosure. So it's an option, another tool in your tool belt to help you overcome these nasty lead time issues and problems that a lot of companies are having in delivering product. And it's been tricky for us as well. I'm not going to minimize that. But once again, thanks for joining us this week, and we look forward to seeing you again next week, and stay safe out there.